I never thought I would hear laughter like that directed at me, not from someone who called herself family. It happened at a rooftop party in downtown Chicago. Glass walls, golden lights, waiters floating by with champagne like ghosts of luxury. My son Daniel had invited me, insisting it was important. "You should come, Mom," he had said. "It's the company's 10-year celebration." So I came. I wore my best dress, a simple dark green one I had kept for years. Not expensive, but elegant enough. At least, I thought so. I should have known better. "Oh, and this is Anna, Daniel's mother," Claire said, her voice sweet in that artificial way that always made my stomach tighten. She smiled at the group of executives around her, then added lightly, "She still prefers simpler things." A few people chuckled politely. I stood there, holding my small purse, feeling like I had accidentally walked into the wrong life. Claire stepped closer to one of the women and lowered her voice just enough for everyone to still hear. "She refuses to move out of that old house. Honestly, I don't know how Daniel grew up like that." More laughter. My chest tightened. I looked at my son. He smiled. Not proudly. Not defensively. Just nervously. As if this was normal. As if I was something to manage. "I'll just get some air," I murmured. No one stopped me. Not even Daniel. The hallway leading to the restroom was quiet, dimly lit, a sharp contrast to the glittering chaos behind me. I walked in, closed the door, and finally let my shoulders drop. For a moment, I just stared at myself in the mirror. Gray strands in my hair. Lines around my eyes. A woman they thought they understood. A woman they knew nothing about. I leaned on the marble counter and let out a slow breath. If they only knew. If Claire knew. The irony almost made me laugh. Because the company they were celebrating tonight, Northbridge Systems, existed because of me. Because of my husband. Because of everything we sacrificed. And yet here I was, reduced to an embarrassment. A burden. A joke. 25 years ago, there were no rooftop parties. There was a tiny garage, a second-hand computer, and a dream that felt too big for the walls we lived in. My husband, Eric, used to stay up all night coding. I handled the finances, the calls, the clients we didn't have yet. We built everything from nothing, brick by brick, failure by failure. There were months we barely paid rent, years we didn't take vacations. And when Daniel was born, I worked with him sleeping beside my desk, answering calls while rocking his crib with my foot. We didn't just build a company. We built the life, a future, for him. But Eric had one rule, one promise he made me swear to keep. "Don't tell him," he said, lying in that hospital bed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let him grow without it. Let him earn his place. I don't want him living under our shadow." I didn't want to agree, but I did. Because I loved him. Because I trusted him. Because I believed it was the right thing. And for years, I kept that promise. After Eric passed, I quietly took control of what we had built. Not publicly, not visibly, but legally, undeniably. I owned the majority of Northbridge Systems. 52%. Enough to decide everything. Enough to change everything. And yet, I chose not to. I stayed invisible. I attended meetings through proxies. I signed documents through lawyers. I watched from a distance as my son climbed the ladder, believing every step was his alone. I was proud of him. So proud. Even when he never knew. Even when he stopped visiting as often. Even when Claire entered his life and slowly began rewriting how he saw me. I splashed water on my face. "Get it together, Anna," I whispered. I wasn't weak. I wasn't what they thought. And I certainly wasn't what Claire believed me to be. When I returned to the party, Claire was laughing again, holding a glass of champagne, glowing under the lights. Daniel stood beside her. He looked tired. I noticed it now. The tension in his jaw. The way he kept adjusting his tie. "Anna," Claire called out. "Come tell everyone about your little garden project. It's adorable." I smiled. A calm, Polite smile. It keeps me busy. What she didn't know was that my garden project funded 2 startups and a scholarship program. But I didn't correct her. Not yet. Later that evening, as people began to leave, I walked toward the exit quietly. That's when I heard them. Claire's voice. Sharp. Controlled. We need to talk about your mother, Daniel. A pause. Then him. What about her? She can't keep coming to events like this. It reflects badly on you. My heart stopped. She's my mother, he said, but it sounded weak. Uncertain. She's holding you back, Claire replied. You're about to be promoted. People notice these things. Silence. Then, I'll talk to her. Something inside me cracked. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough to change something. I didn't wait for them. I left. Took a cab home. Watched the city lights blur through tears I didn't want to admit were there. 5 years. 5 years of silence. 5 years of honoring a promise. But Eric never imagined this. He never imagined someone like Claire. Someone who would turn my son against me. Slowly. Carefully. Efficiently. When I stepped into my house, our house, everything felt different. The walls, the photos, the quiet. I walked into the living room and picked up a picture of Eric. You didn't see this coming, I whispered. Neither did I. That night, I made a decision. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of something stronger. Clarity. I couldn't stay invisible anymore. Not if it meant losing my son. Not if it meant destroying everything we built. Tomorrow, I would call our lawyer. And for the first time in years, I would step back into the light. Claire thought I was nothing. A burden. A shadow. She had no idea who she had just humiliated. And soon, she would. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, though I barely slept at all. My house was quiet in that heavy, almost suffocating way, the kind of silence that makes your thoughts louder than they should be. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at an old photograph I hadn't taken out in years. Eric and I stood in front of our first office, if you could even call it that. It was a narrow room above a repair shop, barely big enough for 2 desks, wires running along the walls like veins. We looked exhausted and impossibly happy. That was the day everything started. Back when success wasn't guaranteed, when failure felt closer than breathing, and when every small win felt like a miracle. I traced his face in the photo with my finger and felt that familiar ache in my chest. We did it, he had told me that day. No matter what happens, we built something real. And we had. But somewhere along the way, I became a stranger to my own story. The doorbell rang, pulling me out of the past. I didn't need to check who it was, I already knew. There was only one person who still came this early, without warning. I opened the door to see Mr. Jonathan Reed, our family lawyer, standing there with the same composed expression he'd worn for decades. He stepped inside, placing his briefcase carefully on the table like it carried something fragile, something important. You sounded different on the phone, he said, watching me closely. Something's changed. I let out a quiet breath and sat down across from him. It has, I replied. And then I told him everything. The party. Claire's words. Daniel's silence. The conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Each sentence felt heavier than the last, like I was finally saying out loud what I had been trying to ignore for years. Jonathan didn't interrupt. He just listened, his fingers steepled together, his expression growing more serious with every detail. When I finished, the room fell into silence again. But this time it wasn't empty. It was full of truth. Anna, he said finally, you've honored Eric's wishes longer than anyone could reasonably expect. But this situation, this isn't what he intended. I shook my head slowly. He wanted Daniel to earn his place. And he did. Yes, Jonathan agreed. But Eric never intended for you to be disrespected. Or erased. That word lingered in the air. Erased. Because that's exactly what it felt like. like I had slowly faded out of my own life while everyone else moved forward without me. Jonathan opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder, sliding it toward me. The company's latest valuation, he said. I didn't need to look. I already knew what it would say. Growth. Expansion. Profit margins higher than we ever imagined in those early days. Still, I opened it anyway. Numbers filled the page. Numbers that represented years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and risks that could have destroyed us. You're no longer just comfortable, Anna, he continued. You're powerful. More than anyone in that room last night. I closed the folder slowly. And yet none of them see it, I said, because I chose not to be seen. I leaned back in my chair, letting my gaze drift again to the photograph. Do you remember how it started? I asked quietly. Jonathan smiled faintly. Better than most. I nodded, letting the memories surface. Eric was repairing computers out of our apartment. I was taking calls, pretending we had an office, a team, something bigger than what we were. We saved every dollar. Every single one. We skipped meals sometimes just to keep things going. I paused, remembering the nights we almost gave up. When I got pregnant with Daniel, I was terrified. I thought it would end everything, that we wouldn't survive it. Jonathan raised an eyebrow slightly. But you did. I smiled faintly. Barely. I was answering client emails from the hospital bed. 3 weeks later, I was back at work with Daniel sleeping in a basket beside my desk. Those were the hardest years, but also the most meaningful. We weren't just building a business. We were building a future for our son. And he never really saw it. I added quietly. Not the struggle. Not the fear. By the time he was old enough to understand, we had already made it. Jonathan nodded. So you gave him a different life? Yes, I said. A normal one. Or as close to normal as we could manage. We never told him where the money came from. We made it look like we were just getting by. I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. We even sold our first house just to make it believable. That must have been difficult, Jonathan said. It was necessary, I replied. At least, that's what we told ourselves. The room grew quieter again as I reached the part one had avoided the longest. And then Eric got sick, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Everything changed so fast. One day we were planning the future, and the next, I stopped. I didn't need to finish. Jonathan already knew. He made me promise, I continued, that I wouldn't tell Daniel about the company, about the shares, about anything. My hands tightened slightly. He was so sure it was the right thing. He said Daniel needed to stand on his own, that knowing the truth would only complicate his life. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. And what did you think? He asked. I hesitated. I thought. I didn't want to lose him too, I admitted. Agreeing felt like the only thing I could do. Jonathan studied me carefully. And now? I looked at him, really looked this time. Now I think I've already started losing him, anyway. That was the truth I hadn't been ready to admit until now. He nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting that answer. Then the question isn't whether to act, Anna, he said. It's how. I exhaled slowly, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Something steadier. I don't want to hurt Daniel, I said firmly. And I don't want to destroy his confidence. If I suddenly reveal everything, it could do exactly what Eric feared. But doing nothing isn't an option anymore, Jonathan replied. No, I agreed. It isn't. We sat there for a moment, both thinking. Then he spoke again. There's something else you should know, he said carefully. We've been monitoring certain developments within the company. I frowned slightly. What kind of developments? He opened another folder, this one thinner, but somehow heavier. New external partnerships. Aggressive proposals. Influence from outside consultants. My mind immediately went to Claire, to the way she spoke, the way she pushed, the way she always seemed to be steering Daniel towards something bigger, faster, riskier. You think she's involved? I said quietly. Jonathan didn't answer directly. I think, he said instead, that someone is guiding decisions that don't align with the company's original principles. I stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the quiet street. The garden Eric and I planted years ago was just beginning to bloom again. She's changing him, I said. I can see it now. The pressure, the ambition, it's not his. Not entirely. Jonathan joined me, his voice calm but firm. Then you need to see it for yourself. I turned slightly. What do you mean? He met my gaze. Go there. To the company. Not as the owner. Not yet. Just observe. The idea settled into my mind instantly. Simple. Direct. Necessary. I nodded slowly. I'll go tomorrow, I said. As his mother. Jonathan gave a small approving nod. That's a good place to start. As he left, I remained by the window, watching the light shift across the garden. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt awake. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. The next day, I stood across the street from the Northbridge Systems headquarters, looking up at the glass tower that reflected the sky like it belonged to another world. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stood there, hands wrapped around the strap of my bag, watching people in sharp suits walk in and out as if they owned time itself. And in a strange way, I did own this place. Not symbolically, not emotionally, legally, completely. And yet I felt like a stranger standing outside my own life. I took a breath and stepped forward. Inside, everything smelled like polished marble and quiet ambition. The lobby was bright, almost sterile, filled with soft conversations and the faint tapping of heels against the floor. I approached the reception desk, where a young woman barely looked up at me at first. Can I help you? She asked, her tone polite but distant. I'm here to see Daniel Hayes, I said calmly. I'm his mother. That got her attention. She glanced at me more carefully this time, not rudely, just measuring. Then she nodded and made the call. A few minutes later, I saw him walking toward me. Daniel looked surprised. Not happy. Not upset. Just caught off guard. Mom? What are you doing here? He asked, lowering his voice slightly as he approached. I smiled gently and held up a paper bag. I brought you lunch. Your favorite. For a second, something softened in his expression. Something familiar, something from years ago. You didn't have to do that, he said, but he took the bag anyway. I know, I replied. I wanted to. He didn't take me to his office. Instead, he led me to a small break room tucked away near the back. I noticed it immediately. The hesitation, the quiet decision to keep me out of sight. I didn't comment on it. I just followed. We sat down, and for a few minutes, everything felt almost normal. He ate, I asked about his work, and he gave me careful, surface-level answers. But I could see it now, clearer than ever. The exhaustion, the pressure, the way he kept glancing at his phone like it might demand something from him at any second. You look tired, I said softly. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so much like Eric's that it made my chest ache. Big week, he admitted. There's a major proposal coming up. If it goes well, it could mean a promotion. I nodded slowly. And Claire? I asked. He gave a small, strained smile. She's invested in it. She really wants us to move forward. There's this neighborhood, Riverstone Heights. She says it's where we belong. I didn't respond right away. I knew that neighborhood. Multi-million-dollar homes. A place built more on appearances than substance. That's the ambitious, I said carefully. Yeah, he replied, though his voice carried a hint of doubt. She thinks it's the next step. After lunch, I stood up and smoothed my dress. I should go, I said. I know you're busy. He nodded, already half distracted again. Thanks for coming, Mom. For a brief second, I thought he might hug me, but he didn't. He just gave a small smile and walked me toward the hallway. I turned toward the restroom, but once I was out of sight, I didn't go inside. Instead, I kept walking. I don't know what made me do it. Instinct, maybe. Or something deeper, something that had been building since the night of the party. I moved quietly through the corridors, taking in everything. The offices, the glass walls, the people who nodded politely, without recognizing me. Some of them had been there since the early days. I recognized their faces, even if they didn't recognize mine. That was the strange thing about invisibility. You see everything. No one sees you. As I reached the executive floor, the atmosphere shifted. Quieter, sharper, more controlled. Most of the offices were empty, lunch hour still lingering. And that's when I heard her voice.
Claire.
It drifted through a slightly open conference room door. Light, confident, but different from how she spoke in public. There was something else in it. Something calculated. I slowed my steps, my heart beginning to beat faster without fully understanding why. "Trust me," she said. "It's already moving in the right direction." There was a pause, then a man's voice answered. Smooth, low, unfamiliar. "You're certain he'll push it through?" "Daniel will do whatever he believes is necessary," Claire replied. "He wants that promotion. He needs it." Something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. "And the board?" the man asked. Claire laughed softly. "The board is cautious, predictable. But once Daniel is in the right position, they won't have much choice." I felt my fingers press lightly against the wall beside me as I leaned closer, barely breathing. "And what about the majority shareholder?" the man continued. "No one seems to know who actually controls those shares." My heart skipped. Claire's voice lowered slightly. "It's tied up in a trust, from what Daniel told me. Eventually, it'll come to him." She paused, then added, almost casually, "And when it does, everything changes." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything she had said. Then I heard movement, a chair shifting, and something else, something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. I didn't need to see it to understand. The tone, the closeness, the familiarity. I stepped back immediately, my pulse loud in my ears. I didn't stay. I couldn't. I turned and walked quickly down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. By the time I reached the elevator, my hands were shaking. It wasn't just ambition. It wasn't just influence. It was manipulation. Careful, calculated, planned. And Daniel was right in the center of it. I barely remember the ride home. The city blurred past the window, but my mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying every word, every tone, every implication. By the time I stepped inside my house, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I called Jonathan immediately. He arrived faster than I expected, and this time, he wasn't alone. With him was Margaret Ellis, a former senior executive who had worked closely with Eric and still quietly advised on company matters. If Jonathan was logic, Margaret was instinct, sharp, perceptive, and impossible to fool. We sat in the living room, and I told them everything I had heard. Not just the words, but the way they were said, the intention behind them, the silence between them. Margaret's expression darkened almost instantly. "That sounds like Victor Lang," she said. "Consultant. Reputation for aggressive expansion strategies. High risk. High reward, mostly for himself." Jonathan nodded. "We've seen his name come up recently." I felt a cold wave settle over me. "They're using Daniel," I said quietly. "Not just for the proposal, for control." Neither of them argued. "There's more," I added, forcing myself to say it. "Claire mentioned the shares. She believes everything will eventually go to Daniel." Jonathan and Margaret exchanged a look. "That explains her long-term interest," Margaret said. "She's positioning herself." I swallowed. "And Daniel?" I asked. "Where does he fit into her plan?" This time, neither of them answered immediately. They didn't have to. I stood and walked to the window again, staring out at the garden. "I promised Eric I would protect him," I said. "But this isn't protection anymore. It's negligence." My voice steadied as I turned back to them. I won't expose everything. Not yet. That could push Daniel further toward her. Jonathan nodded slowly. So, what's your plan? I met his gaze. I'm going to the board meeting. Margaret raised an eyebrow. As yourself? I shook my head. Not yet. A small, controlled smile formed on my lips. I think it's time they finally meet the person they've been ignoring all these years. The morning of the board meeting arrived wrapped in gray skies and steady rain, as if the city itself understood that something was about to shift. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror longer than usual, studying the reflection staring back at me. For years, I had dressed to disappear, soft colors, simple lines, nothing that drew attention. Today was different. Today, I couldn't afford to be overlooked. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, structured and precise, paired with a crisp white blouse that felt unfamiliar against my skin. My hair, once left to fall naturally with its streaks of gray, had been styled into a smooth, controlled shape, darker than before, closer to the woman I used to be. Even my posture felt different, straighter, steadier, intentional. For a moment, I barely recognized myself. And then I realized that was the point. Margaret stood behind me, arms crossed with quiet approval. Now you look like someone they'll listen to, she said. I adjusted the sleeve of my jacket and gave a small nod. I've always been someone worth listening to, I replied calmly. They just never noticed. She smiled faintly. Then today they will. I picked up my bag, feeling the weight of more than just documents inside it. Today carried years of silence, restraint, and patience. And I was done pretending that silence was strength. The boardroom sat at the top of the building, surrounded by glass walls that overlooked the entire city. I entered beside Margaret, my steps measured, my expression neutral. Conversations paused almost immediately. Heads turned, not because they recognized me, but because they didn't. I could feel their curiosity, their quiet attempts to place me, to understand who I was and why I was there. At the center of the room sat Daniel. He looked tired again, but sharper than yesterday. Focused. Determined. Beside him sat Claire, poised and polished as always, her confidence radiating outward like armor. And next to her him, Victor Lam. Even without an introduction, I knew. The way he carried himself, the ease in his posture, the subtle arrogance in his gaze, it all matched what I had imagined. Margaret, said the chairman, Richard Cole, standing as we approached. And his eyes shifted toward me. Margaret didn't hesitate. This is Ms. Wilson, she said smoothly, representing a significant shareholder interest. A murmur moved through the room like a ripple in still water. The name meant something. It always had. For years, Wilson had been a shadow presence, a vote that appeared through proxies, a voice that influenced outcomes without ever being seen. And now that shadow had a face. I inclined my head slightly, but said nothing, taking a seat near the head of the table. Daniel glanced at me more than once, a faint crease forming between his brows. Something about me felt familiar to him. I could see it, but not enough to break through the illusion. Claire, on the other hand, watched me openly, suspicion flickering behind her composed smile. Victor's gaze lingered longer than necessary, assessing, calculating. I welcomed it. Let them wonder. The meeting began with routine updates, numbers, projections, discussions that would have bored me once, but now felt like a quiet reminder of everything Eric and I had built. I spoke rarely, and when I did, my words were deliberate, measured, impossible to dismiss. I could feel the shift happening slowly, attention sharpening, respect forming where curiosity had been. And then, finally, the moment arrived. Next item, Richard announced. The strategic expansion proposal. Daniel, the floor is yours. Daniel stood, adjusting his ties slightly before moving to the front of the room. For a second, I saw Eric and him so clearly it nearly broke my composure. The same focus, the same determination, but beneath it, something else. Pressure. Urgency. The need to prove something. Not to himself, but to someone else. He began his presentation confidently, outlining the expansion into international markets, the projected growth, the partnerships already in discussion. The numbers were impressive at first glance, bold, ambitious, designed to excite. But the more he spoke, the more I saw the cracks. Assumptions presented as certainty. Risks softened into footnotes. Dependencies hidden behind optimistic language. And behind it all, Victor. When Daniel finished, a brief silence followed. Then Victor leaned forward slightly, his tone smooth and persuasive. "If I may add," he said, "my firm has extensive connections that would allow this expansion to proceed faster than traditional timelines. We're not just discussing opportunity, we're discussing inevitability." Claire smiled, clearly pleased. I felt my pulse steady. It was time. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm but firm enough to cut through the room. "Mr. Hayes," I said, addressing my own son as if he were a stranger. "Your presentation is ambitious. But ambition without foundation is simply risk in disguise." The room stilled instantly. All eyes turned to me. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "Could you clarify?" he asked carefully. I nodded slightly. "Of course. Your projected returns rely heavily on accelerated market penetration, yet your data assumes stable external variables. What contingencies have you prepared for volatility?" His confidence faltered slightly. "We've accounted for potential fluctuations. Have you?" I interrupted gently, not raising my voice, but not allowing him to regain control. "Or have you relied on projections provided by external consultants with vested interests?" Victor's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Claire's smile disappeared. The questions continued, each one precise, each one dismantling a different part of the proposal. Not aggressively, not emotionally, just truthfully. I wasn't attacking Daniel. I was exposing what had been built around him. By the time I finished, the room had shifted completely. Skepticism replaced enthusiasm. Doubt replaced momentum. Claire was the first to break. "Excuse me," she said sharply, leaning forward. "Who exactly are you to question this proposal? Daniel has worked incredibly hard on this." I turned my gaze to her slowly. "Effort does not guarantee accuracy," I replied. "And this board is responsible for more than effort. It is responsible for outcomes." Victor spoke next, his tone controlled, but edged. "With all due respect, Ms. Wilson, you seem to be implying bias without evidence." I met his eyes evenly. "On the contrary, I'm suggesting that evidence deserves closer examination." Richard cleared his throat, clearly sensing the shift. "Perhaps we should consider postponing the decision until further review," he said. I nodded slightly. That would be a prudent course of action. The vote was quick, decisive. The proposal was tabled. Claire stood abruptly, her composure cracking. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, grabbing her bag. Victor followed her, his expression colder now, less controlled. They left without another word. Daniel remained seated, still, silent. I watched him for a moment, something inside me tightening. Part of me wanted to go to him, to comfort him, to explain everything. But I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I stood and approached him as Ms. Wilson. "Your core idea has merit," I said quietly, "but it needs to be built on something stronger than urgency." He looked up at me, confusion and frustration mixing in his expression. "Thank you," he said slowly. Then, after a pause, "Have we met before?" For a fraction of a second, I hesitated. Then I shook my head lightly. "Only through your work," I replied. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. In the elevator afterward, I finally exhaled. Margaret stood beside me, watching my reflection in the mirrored wall. "That was defective," she said. I nodded slightly, though my mind was already moving ahead. "It's not over," I replied. "Not even close." She studied me carefully. "What's next?" I met my own reflection, seeing both the woman I had been, and the one I had become. It's time he knows. The words felt heavier than anything I had said that day, but also inevitable, because the truth, once it starts to surface, doesn't stop. And neither would I. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from the boardroom over and over again. Daniel's expression, Claire's anger, Victor's silence, the way the entire room shifted in a matter of minutes. For years, I had stayed in the shadows, convincing myself it was the right thing, the noble thing, the promise I had to keep. But now that I had stepped forward, even partially, I could feel the weight of everything I had been holding back pressing against me, demanding to be released. The truth had started to surface, and there was no way to push it back down again. Not after this. I got out of bed before sunrise and walked into the kitchen, the house still wrapped in that quiet stillness I had grown used to. I made coffee out of habit but forgot to drink it, my thoughts already racing ahead to what needed to happen next. I had decided the night before that I would tell Daniel everything. Not gradually. Not carefully filtered. Everything. Because anything less would only continue the same cycle of half-truths and distance that had brought us here in the first place. But before I could even prepare myself, my phone rang. It was Jonathan. "Anna, we have a problem," he said immediately, his voice tighter than I had ever heard it. My grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of problem?" "Claire moved faster than we expected," he replied. "She convinced Daniel to call an emergency board meeting this morning." I felt my stomach drop. "On what grounds?" "Executive restructuring," Jonathan said. "If it passes, several key members, the ones who have been protecting the company's original direction, will be removed." I closed my eyes for a moment, already understanding what that meant. Control. Influence. Power. Redirected quietly, but permanently. "And Daniel agreed to this?" I asked. There was a pause. "He's under pressure, Anna. And there's more. Claire has discovered a connection between you and Wilson." My eyes snapped open.
How?
"We're not sure," Jonathan admitted. "But Daniel has been asking questions. Direct ones." Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. I didn't need to guess. I already knew. I ended the call and walked slowly to the door, my heart pounding harder with every step. When I opened it, Daniel stood there, his expression stormy, his eyes filled with something I had never seen directed at me before. "Were you ever going to tell me?" he demanded, pushing past me into the house before I could answer. I closed the door quietly behind him, steadying myself. "Daniel, please." "No," he cut me off, turning sharply. "You don't get to please your way out of this. I want the truth. All of it." His voice wasn't just angry. It was hurt. Deeply, painfully hurt. I took a slow breath. "Sit down," I said gently. He didn't move. "I'm not sitting," he replied. "Then I'll stand with you," I said. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Years of distance, silence, misunderstanding, all of it sitting between us like something solid. Then he spoke again, his voice lower but no less intense. "Are you Wilson?" he asked. "Do you own the company?" There it was. No more shadows. No more distance between the question and the truth. "Yes," I said. The word hung in the air. Simple. Heavy. Unavoidable. Daniel stared at me like he didn't recognize me. "You've been a what? Controlling everything this whole time? While I was working there, thinking I earned my position?" His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and that hurt more than anything else. "You did earn it," I said firmly. "Every single step." He shook his head, running his hand through his hair. "Then why?" he demanded. "Why would you hide something like that from me?" I held his gaze, refusing to look away. "Because your father asked me to," I said quietly. That stopped him. Not completely, but enough. "He believed you needed to build your own path," I continued. "Without influence, without doubt, without anyone questioning whether you deserved your place." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "And you agreed to that?" "I did," I said, because I believed it too, and because I didn't want to lose him before I had to. The room fell silent again. The weight of Eric's absence filled the space between us. "And what about you?" Daniel asked after a moment, his voice quieter now. "What did you want?" That question cut deeper than anything else he had said. I hesitated just for a second. "I wanted to protect you," I answered honestly. "And I thought this was the way to do it." He looked away, processing, struggling. "Protect me," he repeated. "By lying to me for years? By giving you a chance to succeed on your own?" I corrected gently. "Do you know how many people in that company respect you? Not because of your name. Not because of me. Because of you." He didn't respond immediately. I could see the conflict in his expression, the way his anger was fighting with something else, something more uncertain. "And yesterday," he asked finally, "at the board meeting, you just destroyed my proposal." "No," I said calmly. "I stopped something that could have hurt you. And the company." His eyes narrowed. "Because of Victor?" "Yes," I replied. "And because of Claire." That brought his attention back instantly. "What about Claire?" he asked, defensive again. I chose my words carefully. "You need to ask yourself why she pushed so hard for that proposal," I said. "And why she's so invested in certain outcomes." "She believes in me," he said quickly. "Does she?" I asked softly. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked away again. That was enough. I walked to my desk and picked up a folder, one I had prepared the night before. "This is information about Victor," I said, handing it to him. "His previous projects, the companies he's worked with, the results." Daniel hesitated, then took it. "You expect me to just believe this?" he asked. "No," I said. "I expect you to verify it." He flipped through a few pages, his expression slowly shifting. Confusion. Doubt. Realization. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked quietly. "Because I was afraid," I admitted. That surprised him. "Afraid of what?" he asked. "Of losing you," I said simply. That was the truth. The real truth. And for the first time, he didn't argue. The board meeting that morning felt completely different from the last. This time, I walked in as myself.
No disguise.
No false name. Just Anna Hayes. Conversations stopped immediately. Confusion spread across faces that had known me only as a distant figure, never as the person sitting at the table. Claire looked stunned. Victor looked concerned. Daniel remained still, but I saw it, the shift in his posture, the quiet decision already forming inside him. Jonathan stepped forward, placing documents on the table. "Anna Hayes is the majority shareholder of Northbridge Systems," he announced clearly. "She holds controlling interest." Silence followed. Then everything began to unravel. Daniel stood slowly. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I need to address something." Claire turned toward him sharply. "Daniel, now is not the time." "It is," he interrupted. And just like that, everything changed. He spoke clearly. About the inconsistencies. About Victor's past. About the risks hidden beneath the proposal. About the pressure he had been under. And finally about Claire. The room listened. Really listened. And when it was over, there was no argument left to make. The proposal collapsed. Victor left without a word. Claire tried to fight, to twist, to regain control, but it was too late. The truth had already taken its place in the room. And Daniel, he chose. Later, when the boardroom was empty, we stood there together in the quiet. "I'm still angry," he said after a while. "I know," I replied. "But I understand now," he added. And that was enough. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something real. Something honest. For the first time in years, we weren't standing on opposite sides anymore. We were finally standing in the same truth. And this time, there were no shadows left between us.